Okay, so picture this with me. A bunch of villagers, mostly women, like they're standing together, arms linked, right there in the foothills of the Himalayas, and they're facing down bulldozers. These women are protecting their trees, their livelihoods, really their whole way of life. It's a powerful image, right? Like the kind of thing you see and it just stays with you. It becomes the image of what grassroots environmentalism is all about. People, just everyday folks, standing up to protect the planet. And, of course, we're talking about the Chipko movement in India. But what if I told you that story we often hear? That, kind of simplified version, the women hugging trees to save them. What if that's just barely scratching the surface? Today we're going deep, like way beyond the posters and the slogans, to uncover the real story of Chipko. We're doing a deep dive into this article from Down to Earth magazine. It's called Many Myths of Chipko. Get ready for some surprises, honestly. We're about to unpack what this movement was really about and why it still matters so much that we understand it, even now, all these years later.
You're totally right to point that out. The popular narrative often misses the mark. It's so important to remember that Chipko wasn't just about protecting the environment. This was about real needs in those communities in Uttarakhand, India, back in the 1970s. These communities, they relied on the forests for everything. Fuel for cooking, fodder for their animals, materials for building, you name it, the forest provided it. So when the government started granting contracts for large-scale logging, it wasn't just trees that were at stake. It was their entire way of life.
So it was about so much more than just hugging trees. It was about protecting their livelihoods, their right to actually benefit from these forests they'd lived in harmony with for generations.
Exactly. Their initial demands were about community rights. They were advocating for local control over the forests, the power to manage the forests sustainably.
So it was about social and economic justice just as much as it was about the environment.
Absolutely. It wasn't even that they're completely against using the forest. It was that they were against other people exploiting their resources without even considering the community's needs.
So this down-to-earth article, it really gets into how that shift happened, how Chipko went from being about community rights and having control over their own forests to this, almost singular focus on save the trees. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
And honestly, a little bit unsettling how easily narratives can get simplified and reshaped over time.
It really is. The article, it points out how that ecological framing, the one that's all about complete bans on cutting down trees, it really took hold around 77, 79. That's when it started dominating. And there was this one leader during that time, Sundarlal Bahuguna. He was a big proponent of deep ecology.
Deep ecology, right?
Which is, it's this whole philosophy that puts more value on nature for its own sake. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Not just for how useful it is to humans.
So it's like you're using a different philosophical lens to look at things, and suddenly the entire focus of the movement seems different. And what about the way we view Chipko through a feminist lens? That's always seemed like such a central part of it, especially with the story of Bhakni Devi. I remember reading about her in Vandana Shiva's book, Staying Alive.
Right.
About how she stood up to her own husband, who was a contractor, right? And he was going to cut down trees in their village. It's such a powerful story, about courage and really standing up for what you believe in. That story's become almost inseparable from how people think about the Chipko movement.
It's definitely had a huge impact on how Chipko is understood. But, and here's another twist, this down-to-earth article, it draws on historian Shekhar Pathak's research, and it reveals some big problems with that popular account.
Hold on. So what we thought we knew about Bhakni Devi and her part in Chipko, that might not be totally accurate.
Yeah.
What are those discrepancies? Tell me more.
For one thing, historical records show that Bhakni Devi's husband, he wasn't actually a logging contractor.
Oh, wow.
He was the head of the village.
Okay.
And according to Doom Singh Negi, another prominent Chipko leader, her husband actually helped warn the villagers about the contractor's plans.
So not exactly the confrontational husband-wife dynamic we've come to expect from that story.
Right.
It seems like a pretty important detail to get wrong.
It is, and it shows how important it is to really scrutinize even those really compelling narratives. Now, this isn't to say women weren't vital to the Chipko movement, because they absolutely were.
Yeah.
They were a huge reason for its success. But what the article is questioning is this idea that it was all driven by this inherent, unified female solidarity. That was the only driving force.
Okay.
For example, Sudesha Ben, she was one of the most prominent women leaders. And even she has said that not all the women participated in the protest.
Which makes sense, right? I mean, social movements are complicated. It's rare for any group of people to be totally on the same page about their views or how to take action.
Exactly. And it's so important to recognize that women participated in such large numbers, often because of the fact that a lot of the men were away looking for work. So while what they did was incredibly brave and impactful,
Right.
it was often about protecting your families and their way of life, not necessarily coming from some ideological place that was against men or even logging in itself.
Right. So a more nuanced understanding needs to recognize both the agency of the women involved and the very real circumstances that shaped the choices they made.
Okay, so we've got Bhakni Devi's story needing a closer look, and this idea of women's participation needing more nuance. Was there anything else that surprised you while you were researching for this deep dive?
You know that really famous Chipko slogan, right? What did the forests bear? Soil, water, and pure air.
I don't know about you, but I always figured that was Bhakni Devi's rallying cry.
Me too. It's like one of those things that just seems so inseparable from the whole Chipko story. You're not going to tell me that's not quite right either, are you? Because at this point, I honestly wouldn't even be surprised.
You're catching on. Turns out that whole powerful phrase was actually coined by Kunwar Presson. He was a journalist who was super involved in reporting on the movement.
Okay, I have to say, hearing all of this is really changing how I view those iconic photos, the ones of the women hugging trees. It really makes you wonder what else about those images might not be what it seems.
That's such a good question. And it actually leads perfectly into our next point. According to Sudesha Ben, a lot of those photos that have become synonymous with Chipko, they weren't actually taken during the protests themselves.
You're kidding. So those images that are practically posters for environmental activism.
A lot of them were staged recreations, often done for people visiting the region after the protests had become well known.
This is blowing my mind. It just goes to show how easily even well-intentioned narratives about something can get simplified and reshaped over time. But it also brings up a bigger question. What are the consequences of getting these details wrong? Why does it matter if we have this romanticized or incomplete understanding of a movement like Chipko? It's like we've been looking at this, I don't know, like an airbrushed photo of Chipko, and we're finally getting to see the original unedited version. But then it makes you think, what's the effect of only ever seeing that touched up version?
That's a really crucial point.
Yeah.
It's not even just about getting the history right, though that's obviously important. These misconceptions, they have consequences in the real world. Like, the article talks about the 1981 ban on tree felling in Uttar Pradesh. On the surface, you'd think, wow, huge win for Chipko.
Right.
Like, total validation of everything they fought for.
And exactly. A total ban on cutting down trees. You'd think that's exactly what they wanted.
Right. Except, and here's where all those nuances we've been talking about come into play. That ban, it actually went against what a lot of the people in the Chipko movement originally wanted.
Really?
Remember how they were talking about wanting control? Like wanting to be able to manage their forests sustainably.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't necessarily want a blanket rule that said no one could use those resources at all.
It's that idea of local control again, isn't it? It's like They didn't want other people making decisions for them, even if those decisions seemed, I don't know, good for the environment in a simplistic way.
Exactly. And it gets to another really interesting thing the article brings up. The way Chipko became this international symbol of conservation. And while that's in some ways positive, that label might have actually and accidentally held back development in Uttarakhand.
How so?
Well, think about it. It's not just a local community managing their own backyard anymore, right?
Yeah.
Suddenly, it's this area with globally important forests that, in the minds of some, should be completely off limits.
Because the stakes are higher now.
Yeah.
It's not just about them anymore.
Exactly. And that way of looking at it, while appealing in some ways, it kind of disregards the fact that those communities, they depended on those forests for their very livelihoods.
Right. Their lives were intertwined with those forests.
Yeah. And their vision was always about sustainable use.
Mm-hmm.
Finding a way to both protect the environment and allow for economic growth that would benefit them directly.
Which brings us back to that central issue we've been circling, right? That constant challenge of trying to balance environmental protection with making sure people can make a living in a way that doesn't destroy the planet. And that's got to be even harder now than it was back then.
Oh, for sure. And the article, it makes a point of highlighting just how much has changed in Uttarakhand over the last 50 years. Education levels are up. More people are moving out to find new opportunities. And then you've got technology changing pretty much everything about life in those communities.
And all of that impacts how people view the environment. how they interact with it, and even their ability to speak up for what they need.
Absolutely. And it leads to this really thought-provoking question that the article poses. Is another Chipko even possible in Uttarakhand today? Like, can you have a movement that demands both environmental protection and local control in the world we live in now?
It's a big question.
It really is. And it's something for all of us to think about. How do we support protecting the environment in a way that doesn't ignore the needs of the people who live in those places, especially in a world that's more connected than ever?
Yeah, there's no easy answers to that. Well, this deep dive has been eye-opening, that's for sure. It really reminds you that even those stories we think we know, the ones that feel iconic, there's often a lot more to them beneath the surface. So, as we wrap up here, what's the one thing you really hope our listeners take away from this conversation?
I'd say it's this. Don't just accept the simple narratives. Question them. Dig a little deeper, Ask yourself who's telling the story and what perspectives might be missing. Because it's only by understanding the nuances, the complexities of these movements that we can actually learn from them. And then, hopefully, we can take those lessons and apply them to the challenges we're facing today.
I couldn't have said it better myself. A huge thank you to our expert for taking us on this deep dive into the Chipko movement. And to all of you listening, we hope this inspires you to look beyond the surface, to embrace those complexities, and to never stop asking those important questions. Because learning is a journey, not a destination, right? Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.